Okay, this is Jake with Wild Jake Survival, and what we're going to do today is we're going to show you how to make a good shelter for the winter. We're going to talk about shelter structure, different designs that you could use, basic shapes of shelters, materials to construct your shelters out of, and we're also going to talk a little bit about how to stay close so that you can be rescued. The four basic types of shelters that are used even today in modern construction as well as primitive construction are a single pitch on the side of a roof. That would be considered a lean-to. An A-frame would be a double pitch with a ridgepole down the center, and that would be an A-frame. Your dome would be like a dome tent or a half circle type shelter, and your cone structures are going to be structures like teepees and cones, structures that are in cylinder type shapes with a point on the top. So those are your basic four structures that you're going to consider when trying to build a shelter. Some things that we want to consider when we're looking for a shelter site. We want to look for something that's natural, but what we want to also look for are places that we can put our shelter that are going to be most effective. We don't want to put our shelter right next to water because the temperature next to water is colder. So we want to back up away from the water between 50 and 100 feet from. We want to be able to keep our shelters warm. We also want to place our shelters about 100 feet away from where we're going to be using the latrine or the facilities. That way we can keep our sanitation, our site and our sleeping area clean. We also want to put our shelter about 100 feet away from our cooking and food preparation area, 100 feet in the opposite direction. This way, if there are any wild animals that come into our camp area, they're going to go to the area where the food is being prepared and not where we're sleeping. So now what we've created is kind of a triangle-like shape where we've got our shelter, our latrine at one point, and our food preparation area at another point. Another thing that we want to look for is terrain features. If we're putting a shelter up and we're inside a canyon, we want to be very careful of that, because things that could happen that could devastate our chances of being rescued are things like avalanches in the winter, and also in the summer and spring we have a lot of wind flow in the canyons. So we have air traveling up and down the canyons in the early morning and late evening, and if we place our shelter in the wrong position, then what's going to happen is the wind is going to come into our shelter and pull all the heat out of our shelter that we've tried to create and keep us cold. So when we put our shelter up and it's inside a canyon, the opening of the shelter needs to be facing perpendicular to the airflow so that our shelter is blocking the air from both up canyon and down canyon. I chose this spot because of the natural protection it already had from the wind and the elements with the trees. The trees being on this side of us made a windbreak. The trees on this side made a windbreak. But in a survival situation, our biggest trick is that we're trying to stay alive long enough to be rescued. We want to make it as easy as possible for our rescuers to find us. If you notice behind me with our vehicle here in the background, that you never want to leave your vehicle. There are some cases in the winter where staying inside a vehicle as opposed to inside a shelter is less effective, so you want to build a shelter and get out of the vehicle. However, you don't want to leave the vehicle because the vehicle is a bigger target for them to be able to see from the air. So for rescuers to be able to find you, you want to stay near and around your vehicle, but you don't always want to stay in your vehicle in freezing temperatures because it becomes an ice box. It doesn't make for a good shelter. Another thing is that in the summer, the vehicle acts just the opposite. Because of its windows, it creates an oven effect. The sun travels to the point where the shade is constantly moving from one side to another. So it's easier to get out of the vehicle and build a proper shelter that actually has black shade that you can get out of the sun completely with, where temperatures are going to be 20 degrees cooler in the shade instead of trying to fight where you're going to position yourself inside the vehicle. You'll be able to be more comfortable and you can lay down fix it up and move around if you need to. So doing that would be a much better idea than just sitting in the vehicle and rolling down the windows. What I want to do is try and find as much green vegetation like pine boughs and things like that, and use those to line my shelter with so that I stand out in contrast to my surroundings. We want to just make sure too that we're putting our shelters in a place that's very public. So next to main trails, waterways. Now again, not at the water's edge, it's 50 to 100 feet back from it so that we're not freezing, but close enough that we can get to it, see people that are there. When they can walk down a main path and find me, it's going to be much quicker and much easier, and everyone's going to go home a lot sooner and be a lot happier. So the first step in building a shelter is looking for something that nature's already provided for us. By using the natural material that's already around, it saves work and time when you're building a shelter. When you build your shelter, you want to find a ridge pole if you're going to build an A-frame or a lean-to. Things that we're going to look for: fallen trees, logs that we can lean things against, large stone surfaces like boulders or cavities in rocks that we can use with overhangs and things like that. A grove of trees with young saplings that can be cleared out in the center and then bent around to join at the top so that you create a dome type shelter. And if you have a tarp with you, making a tripod and then wrapping your tarp around it to make a teepee type structure are very simple, easy shelters to make that can be made fairly quickly. This right here is an example of a debris shelter. A debris shelter is made with natural materials that are found just in the area, in conjunction with these live trees as support. In this situation, they found a tree that had a limb at the right height that stuck out and was clean of branches so that we could use that as our A-frame. So instead of having to build a structure, I could just lean branches up against it, and it did most of the work for me, and it supported and carried the load of the shelter. This shelter right here is much too big for one person, but for several people it works well. Another problem that people make is that they make their shelters too short, and so they can't properly lay down in their shelter. If that's the case, you need to extend the shelter and make it so that you can stretch out and be completely covered. When we were building our shelter and clearing out the debris that was there, I was trying to mark out on the ground kind of a footprint of where my shelter was going to be, how long and how big it needed to be for me to be inside it. The second thing that I was doing was I was clearing out any rocks or sticks or debris that would hurt me if I were to lay down or sit down in that area. I was also cleaning out anything like insects and bugs. I'm gonna go gather some more wood and get going on the rest of this. All right, nice and long. Okay, now that I've gathered enough wood for the frame of my shelter, I'm going to go ahead and start putting it together. We're going to change the structure of this shelter a little bit. Instead of using both these branches, we're going to use this main beam that's coming off the tree here and make just a solid A-frame. We're going to be able to use a lot less wood and material to do that. Where this shelter will do me a lot of good is that it's facing south-southeast, so that it's exposed to the daylight sun. So the wind coming out of the north, and because of the way the canyons are situated here, I'm going to block the wind that's coming down that's cold but I'm going to allow the heat all day from the sun to heat my shelter. By modifying it just a little bit will actually prove to be a better shelter in the long run. So that's how we're going to do that, and I'll put the frame up now. When you find a ridge pole, if you're going to build an A-frame or a lean-to, you want to lean heavier or thicker logs and sticks up against it so that you make a frame that's spaced evenly apart. And then you want to take smaller sticks and you want to weave those sticks in like lattice work so that they crisscross each other like this. When you do that, you then create places that you can hang branches from with leaves on them. Rule of thumb, if it's dead and it's in your way, break it so it doesn't poke you. Once we have the main supports on, the more debris we can stack up on there and just kind of fill it in and make it as thick as possible, the better we'll be able to thatch it with this bark like this when we're done. And we'll be able to actually just keep stacking it up so that it completely blocks out the light on the inside and the wind from the outside. So, got a lot of work to do, but we're getting there. It's taking shape. One of the big tricks to staying dry is properly thatching the construction of your shelter. Now you can see all the wind coming through here. How cold it is. Makes it feel pretty cold. Thatching is huge and it takes a lot of time. A whole bunch of green boughs like this to thatch the shelter with, but I'm not gonna cut them all from the same trees. I'm gonna spread it out so that I don't kill all the trees and so that I create as little damage as possible and kind of spread it out so it doesn't look like I've just mangled one tree. So we'll collect a bunch of these and thatch the roof and put some down to lay on and get off the ground. The trick to insulation is that insulation is dead air space. Dead air space is anything that you can put between you and something else. Jackets work on that same principle. So inside your jacket you'll have a liner, and that liner a lot of times will have batting on it like this, and that batting is creating pockets of air. And what happens is your body heat warms up that air pocket and then it traps it between this layer. And the trick to staying warm is using insulation like that. I'm starting at the bottom so that as I thatch this and I work my way up, they layer on each other so that if it rains, they roll off like shingles. You want to start at the bottom of your shelter and hook those leaves so that they're hanging down like this, and then hook some on the next layer up and hang those over the top so that you're literally creating a shingle effect like this, going from the bottom to the top. That way when water or any type of precipitation lands on the shelter, it lands on the top shingle and rolls down and off, instead of the opposite way where it would land this way and then roll between the shingles and into the shelter. So always start from the bottom and then lay the next one up on top, going up the shelter. Once you've done that, you want to take as much debris and things that you can find and pile it up on top of the shelter. So that way you create those pockets of air and those dead air spaces. And once you've done that, all the heat that you generate on the inside of the shelter will radiate into those pockets and warm those up, and then they will be like a blanket of warm air and keep you warm. When you're in the shelter, if you can see daylight through your shelter, then you don't have enough insulation on the shelter. So continue to put debris on it until you can't see any daylight. Get all those little sharp pokey things out of the way so that you don't stab yourself in the eye. Snow would be a nice thing. If it snowed, then I'd be able to let it all pack in and insulate me even more. So I wouldn't mind it if it snowed, but rain's a bad thing in a situation like this where you're trying to stay dry. This juniper bark makes great bedding, great nesting material. However, it also carries ticks, so you have to be careful, and it peels off really, really easily. And this bark, when it gets old, it starts to shred and peel away from the tree anyways. It starts to just hang. So peeling this off isn't really hurting this juniper tree. It naturally sheds it. Alright, so this is the bark that I gathered so that I can make my bedding. We want to make sure that we're sleeping off of the ground on a pad. Now, that pad can be made from pine needles, leaves, pine boughs, bark, grass, anything that you can find. You can see how thick this mat is. And again, if I really wanted to stay even warmer, I would make this mat about this thick, because I'm going to compress it down when I lay in it. And the rule of thumb is, for every inch of insulation you have above you, you want 2 inches of insulation below you. So, snuggling up on this, as long as my core is on this mat, then I'll be able to keep warm. It's a lot more comfortable than sleeping directly on the ground, and it's providing me a cushion against the ground so the earth doesn't suck away my heat. With this and a fire out in front of the shelter, I think that I could stay warm tonight. I want to plug up that hole right there though. This area right here is a heat reflector. What happens is you build your fire here, and all the heat that comes off of the fire in that direction is pushed back into the shelter, keeping the shelter warm. This over here was a wall that we built as well. This wall used to be about this high, and it was a windbreak from the northern winds. So during the evening and the day when the wind changes and blows through here, it kept the fire from blowing around and kept this place really, really warm. One of the big things that we want to remember when we're building a shelter in a survival situation is that we're constantly improving our shelter. Our shelter is not finished until we're rescued. So there's always something that we can actually be doing to improve. We'll notice that we've got some daylight here, or that there could be a better windbreak over here. So we want to constantly be gathering materials and improving the shelter. Maybe we were cold one night, so we're going to gather more bedding so that we can make our mat thicker, so that we can create more insulation. Remember the type of structures that we're looking for naturally: lean-tos, A-frames, domes, and cones. And look for Mother Nature where she's done most of the work for you. A lot of work. I like it. And try to find places that you can put your shelters next to main trailheads or trails. Try to stay away from water. Keep your shelters away from your latrine facilities and from your cooking and food preparation sites. When we go out and we inspect our shelters that our students make, the biggest thing that we're looking for is, was the shelter big enough for them to actually lay down comfortably in, but was it small enough also that their body could actually heat up the shelter? Did they put enough material on the shelter? We're checking to see if they did their thatching correctly. They used the proper shingling techniques from the bottom to the top. Black shade in the summer, insulation properties and materials in the winter. Remember the half rule, 1 to 2, 1 inch of insulation above you, 2 inches of insulation below you. If they put a heat reflector in front of the shelter, if they were able to get a fire to actually warm the shelter as well, if they've used proper bedding techniques, and be able to definitely survive the night at least. We wouldn't be staying at the Ritz, but hey, there's always work to be done. We could make it that way. From Wild Jake's Survival, we thank you very much for watching, and we invite you to come out and take some courses from us. You can find out more information about our courses on our website at wildjakes.com.